Hi guys, another quick Divinity 2 engine tutorial here, and today I want to talk about terrain editing and the terrain panel. So we can find the terrain panel by clicking this button on top, and this opens our terrain panel, which looks like this. On the left we have our different terrain pieces listed, and when we select the terrain, on the right we will have all the materials listed for that particular terrain. Right now, if I click the terrain 00, I don't have any materials listed, but there is still a default material assigned to this terrain piece, which is listed here in the details for this item under terrain material ID. So if I select this line, click the three dots and open the resource manager, I can actually check and change the terrain type that I'm using. So for example, I can select a lava rock and import it into my terrain by clicking the arrow, and now the terrain texture changes. Just gonna switch it back for now. Do something less dark. Okay, here we go. We can also add different terrain pieces by clicking this button, so we can add another one. For example, select rock, slate, mud, click here, and we're going to have our second terrain piece. And I can move it up a little and move it a little bit to the side. Just gonna change this terrain to rock mudslide as well, so it's less bright. Alright, here we go. I can also add materials to the terrain itself by going into Resource Manager, selecting a resource, and then clicking the plus sign here. So if I click a plus sign, I will have a pop-up asking me if I want to import this as a terrain layer, this particular one, so the rock black, for example. And if I click yes, it appears under the terrain piece. Before we go further, I want to talk about the terrain materials a little bit. And I saw in a tutorial on YouTube, I believe it was a French tutorial by somebody named Maxumi. So if you have a chance and you speak French, check out his channel. That there's two custom parameters here for each terrain type. The custom 1 parameter indicates what type of material it is, which can be useful because you can sort on it. If you want to find dirt, for example, without looking through the search window, for the search bar, you can see all the dirt materials. And another parameter is the custom 2, and that's a variable that sets apart which type of terrain it is. So if we look at the terrains with parameter 12, we're going to see that in the preview we see the sphere showing us a different levels of this terrain. So this is I call it a 3D texture. I don't know the exact technical term for it, but this texture will change with terrain elevation, and it will, if the terrain gradient becomes too steep, the texture will change. And I'll show you how it works. For example, if I raise the terrain, we can see the rocks appear now. So that's what I'm talking about. Once you raise the terrain and the gradient becomes too steep, the texture of the terrain changes, and this can be, of course, very nice for just quickly building terrain and elevation and have it already nicely textured for you. There's another type is the custom parameter 6, and this is just a regular texture. If you select it, you do not see any preview. And for example, if I select the rock black, here and I add it to my terrain, then I can paint it later on the terrain like this. If you try to paint on the terrain a texture who is of type 12, for example this dirt, if I try to add it to my terrain and then I try to paint it, you're gonna see that it appears in squares. I should probably choose a different texture to make it a little more clear. So let's see. How about this one? Base lava rock. I'm gonna remove this one. So if I try to paint base lava rock on the terrain, you see that it appears in squares, which is not really nice for level building. And I believe that's because these textures were designed to be used as a base terrain material ID and not as a texture being painted on top of that. So I don't think they should be used as layers on the terrain later on. Another type of texture we have is the custom parameter 8. There's not many of them, and these are the emissive textures which will look different under different lighting. So for example, we can do the hexagonal floor, which you will recognize from the Hall of Echoes. And if I paint that, we're gonna have this hexagonal floor. And if you set any atmosphere or lighting to this to a map containing this floor, the glow between the rocks will still show through the lighting. So that's why I call this an emissive texture. And another type we have is a parameter 9, which is an animated texture. So for example, if we select this hexagonal floor and paint it on, we see that it doesn't glow, but if I quickly generate a level and do a preview, you're gonna see that when I run on it, the floor starts to glow. So that's the animated texture, and again, I think it was used in the game for Hall of Echoes. There's another type of animated texture, and that is with custom parameter 15. There's not many of them either, and those textures are used for I believe those textures are used for the blood forest. They're here. I'm sorry, that's a parameter 11, not 15. So if I add one of those to the terrain and quickly paint it on, it creates one of those weird organic textures, and if you look closely, you're gonna see that it's a little bit wavy, like there's a hot air above it. So that's the animation. Another good thing to know is that you cannot have two identical textures assigned to one terrain. You can only have one of each type. So no doubles are allowed. However, the nice thing about having several textures is that you can rearrange them as layers by using these buttons, these arrows. So for example, if I paint this blood forest texture over the hexagonal floor and then take the hexagonal floor and move it up a few layers, you can see that now it's painted over the blood forest. So this can be used to assign an order to your textures, to make, let's say, rocks appear above grass, or it can be done for some interesting effects if you're creative enough. So when you're painting the terrain, one interesting option is the clamp, and to access the option of the terrain paint, you right click on the terrain paint icon, and you're gonna have this window open. So you have a brush shape, which can be a circle or a square. There's a edit selected only, which I'll get to a little bit later, maybe in the end of the video. You have a clamp, radius, and strength. The strength is how fast you're gonna paint. So for example, if I set it to 1, my layer, my terrain layer, is going to be painted very slowly. And if I set it to 6, the terrain is going to be painted much faster. So that allows you to control the intensity. The radius can be set either here or by using the square brackets. So for example, I can set it to 10, and I get a much bigger radius to paint with. Now the clamp can be used to paint only a certain percentage of the texture to max out the percentage at which you paint. So for example, if I set it to 0.5 and switch lines, it's only going to paint half of the terrain area. I can set it lower, and I'm going to paint even less. So this can be used to play with different textures that you have and create different effects, such as broken stones, for example, instead of a pavement. So now I think we covered painting the terrain a little bit. Let's talk about raising and lowering the terrain. We have a raise terrain tool, which is here. And it's very simple. Once you select it, you can select the size of the area you want to raise, and left clicking will raise the terrain, and right clicking will lower the terrain. It's very simple. There's not much to it. Again, if you right click on the icon, there's a few options here. You can have a brush shape set to square instead of a circle. Edit selected only. You have the radius and the strength, which is how fast the terrain will raise or lower. After that, we have lower the terrain, which will lower the terrain if you left click. I don't usually use it because you can lower the terrain with raise the terrain tool that I just mentioned. So I don't find much use for that. Next we have flatten the terrain. And this is a very useful tool that allows you to flatten the terrain at a certain level. So for example, here I raised the terrain already, and I can use this tool to create an area that's exactly at the same level as the terrain I created before. So it's very nice for level design because you don't want your players to go up and down all the time. You want to create smooth surfaces for them, even though you want to create variation of height. So this tool is very useful, and this tool can also be used to erase terrain that you don't want to have created. So you can just level up your field this way. If you right click, you have very similar options. So you have the brush shape, which can be a circle and a square. But for this tool, you have clamp, which can be false or true. And if you set it to true, something interesting happens. You can actually assign a specific height that you want to create. So for example, if I assign it to 10, click elsewhere, and then left click on the terrain, I'm gonna raise terrain to height of 10. This can be really useful in creating a level, because I can create something, for example, with the height of 10, then I can switch to a height of 5 and create a terrain next to it with a height of 5. So I can control exactly which height I'm creating for the players. So to create, for example, something that's higher than a player, or to set a specific height, for example, for a bridge or anything like that. So this can be very useful. And you have the radius, you have edit selected only, and that's about it. Actually, I'm not sure about the last variable that's present for every tool, the checkout radius multiplier. So if anybody knows about it, let me know in the comments. I have no idea what it does. So now I created a terrain here, but you see it's very angled and it doesn't look really nice. So we can use the next tool to even it out a little bit. It's a smooth terrain. So this works very simply. You point and left click and it's gonna smooth the terrain for you. So here you see it's working, and just removing all those sharp edges and making it much more realistic looking. The textures are much better. So even on the very sharp increases, it will work to make it look much better. So that's a very simple tool to use. Not much to it. And the last tool we have is a slope tool. I have a little bit of trouble with it because I can't seem to have a control over how long I can plan to do this slope. So if I just drag it quickly like this, it creates a slope, but if I start playing with it, the cursor disappears. I'm not sure if it's a bug or it's something that I have wrong in my setup, wrong in my settings. I'm not sure. Again, if somebody knows more about this, let me know in the comments. I'm very curious to know. But this tool can be used to create slopes from one level to another. Can be useful if you want to have player have a nice way to get up instead of a ladder, for example. So also very useful. So now let's talk about editing the selected terrain only. This is something I found through experimentation, and it can be interesting if you're creating a level out of several pieces. So for example, here I have two different terrains, and if I use raise the terrain, we can see that both pieces of terrain are going to be affected simultaneously and equally. So for example, if I have the second piece of terrain at the same level as the first one, the change is going to be seamless. You will never know that there's two pieces of terrain. However, if I right click on the raise terrain tool and check edit selected only as true, what I can then do is select a certain piece of terrain. So for example, I'm going to select this piece of terrain, and then I can raise it or lower it without affecting my first piece of terrain. Again, that can be very useful if you're creating a complex level and you want to have two different surfaces interact and merge into each other. That's a way to do it. And I think that concludes all the topics I wanted to talk about. See you next time.